My name is David Corey, as I mentioned, with the Emotional Intelligence Training Company, and we're glad that you could join us today for this webinar. We have this wonderful opportunity to talk about emotional intelligence and the importance of learning more about a candidate's emotional intelligence in the recruitment process and how you might do that, different ways of doing that, and then more specifically, how can you bring more of a scientific approach to the recruitment process? And that can be done using tools that are scientifically validated, that have research behind them, and that have been proven to add a lot to the recruitment process. And how do you do that? And so we've got some experience in doing that, and we will certainly share some of that experience with you. So we are just getting going here with our webinar. Welcome, everyone. This is our webinar on emotional intelligence and recruitment. And my name is David Corey, and I'm with the Emotional Intelligence Training Company. And we hope to share with you a little bit about our experience in using the scientific approach to measuring and understanding how someone is functioning with respect to their emotional intelligence skills and competencies, and how to add that to the recruiting process in a way that adds value and makes sense. And so that's what we hope to do today. In terms of who I am and why I'm coming to you today to talk about emotional intelligence and the recruitment process, well, here's my resume. In 1985, completed a Bachelor of what's now known as Kinesiology at the University of Calgary. Went on to do a Bachelor of Education at UBC in 1989, then began my MA in Education. And while I was doing that, I started working as a career development practitioner. And as you may know, career development practitioners are people who help other people get back to work. And so what I was doing was, first and foremost, I was working in the Vancouver Parole Office, helping people who were being released from incarceration back into the community and supporting them with that endeavor through helping them to find jobs, and had a lot of conversations with recruiters and screeners, and worked alongside with them to help place people in jobs that were going to assist with their re-entry into the community and to be successful, etc. And so if you're just joining us now, this is our webinar on recruitment and using emotional intelligence in the recruitment process. My name is David Corey with the Emotional Intelligence Training Company. So just to give you a quick background about me. So from 1989 to 1998, I was involved in career development, and so have some knowledge of recruitment, certainly not an up-to-date, certainly not leading edge in terms of what's going on in recruitment. However, I have some knowledge, and so we'll share that with you. My focus and my expertise is in this area of emotional intelligence, which has been my focus for the past 20 years, and share a bit about that with you. So I've been an emotional intelligence practitioner since 1998, involved in leadership development and team effectiveness, helping organizations to design programs and to help them, to help their managers and their leaders with coaching, and consulting on processes, how to integrate emotional intelligence into various processes and procedures that organizations face, and also have done a lot of keynote speaking in various conferences and large-scale meetings all over the world. This area of emotional intelligence has been a wonderful choice for me in terms of being considered as someone who's got some experience and a bit of a specialty in the area, and it's taken me all over the world. And I really, been grateful that I've had the privilege to be involved with emotional intelligence for such a long time. So that's a little bit about me, and I started the Emotional Intelligence Training Company I started working with emotional intelligence in 1998 when I was working for the Open Learning Agency in Burnaby, BC. And then I started the Emotional Intelligence Training Company in 2000 when I left the Open Learning Agency, and that has been a wonderful learning experience for me. Had the opportunity to work with lots and lots of individuals and organizations, again, worldwide. Our most interesting contract was designing a 20-day emotional intelligence training program for the Republic of Botswana, in Africa, and spending a lot of time there, getting to know the culture, and understanding how emotional intelligence fits with various cultures has been a real interesting challenge that I've had the privilege to be involved in over the course of my career. So let's just do a quick poll here, and we will find out who's on the call, and find out a little bit more about what it is that you do. So if you wouldn't mind just choosing one of these, how would you best describe your role? Now, some of you will probably do more than one thing, of course, we all do, but if you could best describe your role, which one of these would you choose? So, oops, I have to hit the launch poll button. All right, so just select one of these. Are you primarily involved in recruitment? Are you primarily involved in, oh my goodness. Are you primarily involved in coaching? Would you describe yourself as an HR generalist, an HR manager, an HR consultant, or something else? It's interesting. You know, we unfortunately did not have a lot of time, a lot of effort in marketing this webinar, but we still had somewhat over 50 people register, so that's good. You know, we're not out for the thousands and thousands of people registering. We really just want to speak to those who for whom emotional intelligence resonates, and who really want to learn how to use it in recruiting. We have, of course, far fewer people show up live. A lot of people expecting to get the link to watch the recording. And I'm going to end the poll now. And it looks like most people are coaches or HR generalists, and a couple of people are HR consultants or other. Feel free to use the chat box, by the way, anytime that you want to share some information with us or ask a question. You can use the chat box, or you can use the Q&A feature as well. And my plan is to give you some information, have a bit of an information session, and then what I hope to do is to open it up for questions. And so we will do that momentarily. All right, so let's go with, we've got, yes, 33% coaches, 33% HR generalists, and then 33% of you looks like you're in HR consulting or some variation thereof. So let's get back to our presentation, and I'm just gonna perhaps click my video off here and go back to the presentation. All right, so how do we know what sorts of qualities people have, candidates for employment have? Well, one way that we sort of determine whether someone might be right for the position is by their appearance and how they present. And so here we've got this humorous cartoon. Do I look like a people person? So I mean, this is one way, is to just simply take a look and see how people present themselves, and determine based on their image, how they dress, how they present, whether they look like they might be a fit for the organization. So that's certainly one way, is to just take a look at them, and when we meet them, there's this first impression that people make, and of course we do judge books by their cover, and so we do that. Then there's other ways of determining whether someone is a right fit for our organization, and then of course we. And what we're doing really here is, I guess we're getting more specific in the recruitment process. We're not talking about recruiting or attracting applicants so much as we are talking about screening and selection. And so sometimes we do these things like some kind of testing. This cartoon is kind of humorous because it's about finding annoying personality markers in your DNA. Of course, we don't yet do that. However, I heard of one just the other day where there's you arrange pens in a certain pattern, and then ask people questions. What's the first thing you see about this arrangement of pens, and you can tell things by that. So we have lots of various ways of of trying to determine whether someone's right for the job. You know, here's another cartoon. There's lots of great cartoons about recruiting, by the way. So here's this guy, he says, yes, I think I have good people skills. What kind of idiot question is that? And of course, it's funny because he's kind of snapping at her about the question. Then, of course, I had to use this cartoon because it's got my name in it. Besides a great smile, Dave, do you have any other qualifications we would consider for this position? So as recruiters, as people who are selecting people for various positions, you're trying to determine whether this person is going to excel at the position, and whether they're going to integrate, whether they're going to fit with your team, with your company culture, all of those things. Is this person going to integrate? And then, is this person going to give me a return on my investment of their salary? And that's really a big question as to whether someone's going to do that. Then there is asking someone to actually perform the job. And determine their ability in that way. So here you've got, of course, a very humorous look at the IKEA job interview. Have a seat. You got to put it together first, but we're going to see whether you got the skills that we're looking for. So that's another way. Is to determine that. Now, what would be another possibility? Well, let's take a look at our agenda for the webinar this morning. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about traditional recruiting and what are some of the methods that we use specifically for screening and selection, and then talk about this concept of emotional intelligence and how it's a little bit different and it's the same as what we do through traditional recruiting. And then we'll talk about the EQI specifically. And then this idea, which I find very fascinating, is prediction versus exploration. Some of these tools that you have seen and that you may even use are really about whether you can predict whether someone's going to be successful and effective at performing the role. I have a bit of a different take on it, and I'll tell you a little bit about that and tell you what I mean by exploration, and then we'll try to summarize the content and then move to a Q&A, because I really am interested in your questions. So you know, type your questions in at any time, and then we'll cover them during the Q&A process. All right, so what do I mean by recruitment? Well, of course, recruitment is the action of finding new people to join an organization. I think one of the ways that we associate the word recruitment is with the military. How do you recruit people for the military? And so there is this active action of going out there and trying to get people. And of course, with social media and technology now, that is an easier process. And I can only imagine that, you know, with LinkedIn, that you can get hundreds, thousands of candidates for a position quite easily. And so, okay, so you got all those people. That's the recruitment part. What's the next step, or how would you go about then collecting the kind of information that you're looking for about those individual candidates? And that would be the selection, the screening and selection process. So a traditional screening and selection process, that is, how do you collect sources of information? Well, of course, one of those things is the interview. I should probably have switched those around. You know, the resume is probably our first source of information. If we collect resumes, if we accept resumes, if we request resumes, then we're going to have this pile of paper, or maybe that is of course, using technology. You may have a video resume, you may have various other kinds of portfolios perhaps, but people are wanting to tell you about themselves and tell you how they are suited for the position. And so you've got this process. Now, a next stage might be to select various of those resume candidates and bring them in for an interview. And then talk to them, have them physically in your presence, and talk with them about their suitability for the role. So that's another piece. So we've got Apologies for the dogs barking in the background. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do about that. Another source of information might be references. So asking people to provide other individuals' impressions of them, feedback on their past performance, comment on their character, etc. So all of these things as well. And then there are all of the kinds of tests, assessments, kinds of systematic ways we go about collecting information from people. And those might be in the form of an achievement test of some sort. So we might want to test their math skills or possibly their reading skills. Or their spatial awareness, or we might present them with various types and kinds of brain teasers and just see how they do with those. The other aspects of people that we want to perhaps know more about are personality characteristics. And of course, you're probably familiar with many types of personality type indicators, which would give us, again, more information about that individual. We might create or organize some sort of social function, which would be perhaps bringing people together for a wine and cheese party or some other such social function where we would observe candidates in action. So watch how they are with other people, watch how they treat people, watch how they talk about themselves or don't talk about themselves, these kinds of things. Or we might even, in fact, set up something called the assessment center. So, of course, the assessment center is where you would have various types of psychometrics. You might have a whole battery of psychometrics. You might have other kinds of tasks. You might use something that we call an inbox task. So, so someone would sit down at a desk. There would be an inbox of various tasks that they would actually have to perform in the role. And they would have to go through the inbox and make decisions about various types of tasks. So these are all kind of traditional screening selection sources of information, and there may be many others. And so right now, I'd like to ask you, what is your sort of best source or favorite source, if you will, of information? So let's do the next poll here. And we'll go on to poll number 2. All right, so take a look at the list. What is your best source of information? Which one do you like, appreciate, rely on? Which one is works best for you? I'm just going to let you do that and see if there's anything I can do about the dogs, and I'll be right back. Just give you a moment or two to complete that. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there, and we'll take a look at the results. Okay, so we've got 40% of you saying one-to-one interview, 20% saying group interview, 20% saying personality assessment, and 20% saying other. If someone who chose other would maybe just type in the chat box, tell us what other source of information you like, that'd be great. We'll take a look at that. And let's move on. Where's that? Okay, just move that over there and go back to our presentation. All right, so this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Reuven Bar-On. In 1981, Reuven started his PhD, and he started his PhD because he was, as a clinical counselor with the Israeli military, he was working with pilots who were struggling with PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder. He noticed that while he gave them lots of different types of systematic assessment tools, he was interested to realize or notice that IQ did not seem to determine how well people did with their PhD, or sorry, with their PTSD. So what he did was he set about to try to answer this question. And now I'm paraphrasing Reuven. He didn't exactly ask the question in this way, but it's kind of humorous. Why do people do dumb things? Or why do smart people do dumb things? You probably know people who would, test very high with their IQ score, and yet, they struggle socially. They don't seem to be able to fit in the right role. You may have experienced candidates like this for various jobs, people who are technically quite brilliant, and yet they still struggle with other kinds of social and emotional issues. So he set about to create a model by trying to create a measurement tool which would measure this missing piece that traditionally we relied on IQ testing to try to understand whether people were going to be successful or effective, and that just doesn't seem to be complete enough. And so the model that based on Reuven's original work turns out to, and again, Reuven worked with multi-health systems, and they created this model here. So this is the present day model of emotional intelligence based on the original work of Reuven Bar-On. And so what you see here is you see these categories of emotional skills: self-perception, how we perceive ourselves, how we express ourselves, how we are interpersonally, how we make decisions, and stress management. Now, the how we make decisions part is the part that people often say, well, what's emotional about that? How is that emotional? And really how it's emotional is the fact that we filter everything through our emotions. So our brains are not cognitive and emotional. It's always been a bit of a pet peeve of mine, is when people try to differentiate between EQ and IQ. I really don't know that's a good differentiator, because our brains are our brains, and they operate in a holistic way. So the best thing about emotional intelligence is it is the best description of how our brains actually work. Everything we perceive, we put through our emotions, and we decide whether we like it, whether we don't like it, whether it's relevant for us, whether it's not relevant for us, whether it's a threat to us or not a threat to us. And that is a continual process. So emotional intelligence is, again, a better descriptor of how our brains actually work, and it really helps us to understand why some people are able to function better socially and emotionally than others. So how do we then try to get a sense of where people are with respect to this model? How do we understand whether someone has a great self-regard? Well, you know whether someone has a great self-regard when you meet them. Your first impression of them tells you that. Now, how do you validate that, or how do you corroborate that with other information? And of course, what you can do is you can try to come about that in some systematic way. Well, one systematic way is by asking people questions based on the model that you just saw. And back in 2010, you can read this blog. This is a blog post. In fact, it's one of our most frequently read blog posts, and we tell that by Google Analytics. But it's interesting that people are trying to understand the EQ, or the emotional quotient, or how well people do with emotional intelligence skills, and they are wanting to have a set of interview questions, etc., some way of systematically approaching this. I think I must have been coming back from London. That's why the picture of Trafalgar Square there. However, as you can read, my flight gets canceled, Seattle Airport. Somebody asked me if I know of a resource that provides interview questions according to the 15 EQ competencies of the Bar-On model. And I just sat down and wrote out 15 questions, trying to come at it from a behavioral kind of standpoint. Give me an example of a time when, that sort of thing, and certainly you can go and read that. So that's one method, is using the model, and I strongly encourage people to use the model. If you never get certified to use the more scientific approach using the EQI, which I'm going to talk about momentarily, use the model. It's an extremely thorough, comprehensive model of human behavior. It really helps us to understand why some people are effective and other people are not at whatever they choose to do in life. So it's a really important model, and anybody can use it. It is in the public domain, and you can determine whether people are functioning well in those areas or not. Now, the alternative is, of course, the EQI. Now, the EQI is the Emotional Quotient Inventory, and it is published by MHS Assessments, consists of 133 statements or items. It's, of course, it's highly detailed, and it provides 21 emotional intelligence competency scores. So it gives you a total emotional intelligence score, gives you 5 scores in the categories, and then it gives you 15 subscale scores. So these all of this great, fantastic information, which really helps you to understand whether someone is effective or not. Then it further to that, it gives you this wonderful comparison with high-performing leaders. That's the leadership report, quite specifically. All right, so so I wanted to talk with you about the EQI and tell you a little bit more about that. And it takes about 20 minutes for someone to go online and take the EQI. And then what you end up with is a set of scores that looks like this. These are the 21 scores that I mentioned. So we've got the score, the total emotional intelligence score, scores in the 5 composite areas, and the 15 subscale scores. You also see what we call the leadership bar. And the leadership bar is a measure of a particular group of high-performing leaders and their range of scores in each of these areas. And what's great about it is it first of all sort of shows how important a particular skill is for leadership at a higher level. So if you are hiring for a leadership position, you really do want to use the leadership report, which is going to be very important for you in that process. And then it's about understanding that that when people do something like this, take an inventory for when knowing that the information is going to be used in in a selection or a screening process, there may be a tendency for them to try to come up with a better result than might be the real honest truth. And that way we all want to put our best foot forward. And so that's a natural, normal thing to do. And so of course one might do that. Now, what the EQI has to try to mitigate against that is it's got a number of validity indicators which help us to understand more about this data and whether it's appropriate and applicable. There is this inconsistency index. There's a positive and negative impression score. There's asking people whether they were open and honest, and there's an omission rate, and then there is response distribution, all of which we teach more about how to analyze in the EQI certification course. But for now, I want to draw your attention to the positive impression score. So there are various items which are designed to determine whether someone's trying to be more positive than they actually are, or try to make themselves look better than they actually are. So in most cases, for when we use this for recruiting and screening, we find an elevated number here in the positive impression scale. So people are trying to put their best foot forward. Now, you might want to ask, well, how does that still make the EQI results relevant then if people are going to try to increase their scores? Well, the answer is that the correct answer is not always obvious. And so when people are looking through this, they don't know what you're looking for. They don't know whether you're looking for someone who is more or less on these various in these various areas. And so that's why the correct score is not always evident. And when people are too positive, that is, their scores are too high, well, that just raises red flags for us in general anyway. So what do you do? How do you go about finding utility in the results for an EQI? Well, I have some ideas about that. Now, the EQI is a level B assessment. Therefore, the respondent must know the purpose of the assessment, and so you might have to tell them that up front. It's part of informed consent. The respondent must be offered a review of results, and in some cases, respondents don't necessarily take us up on that offer. And I guess that's because their goal is to get employment, and so they're going from application to application, and they don't necessarily want to take the time. However, some do take us up on the offer, and they do benefit as a result. The respondent must know how her or his results will be used, and so that's something that has to be in that consent form. The respondent has a right to review their results following the respondent has a right to receive their results. So we can give the actual report that is created back to the respondent themselves. Now, because it's a level B assessment, and is governed by the Canadian Psychological Association, we are restricted from giving the actual report to the decision maker if the decision maker does not have level B certification. So we can use the EQI, and decision makers can benefit from the information that is obtained through the use of the EQI, but they can't have the actual report. Unless they come take the certification course, in which case, then of course they can bring all this in-house, and they can administer it in-house and use the information directly from the report in-house. So what can they do? Well, what they can do is they can get a recruiting report. So we have developed a way of analyzing the actual report that comes from the EQI, and we produce what we call a recruiting report. So the decision makers, the recruiting officers, the panel interviewers, who are all going to be part of the decision process. Well, what they get is they get information that they can pursue and explore further. So what I mean by this idea of prediction versus exploration, the EQI is an excellent predictor of success. However, we need to ensure that people are responding to the EQI in an upfront and honest way in order for for predictive validity to be effective. And so when people are taking it in application for a job, they may in fact try to guess what the desired answers might be in areas. And so really what we're doing is no different than you would do in an interview. In an interview, you don't know necessarily whether a candidate is responding honestly to your interview questions. In the same way, we are asking a candidate, an applicant, to answer 133 questions using the online protocol, and we don't necessarily know whether they're being honest. However, we have their responses, and so we can hold them accountable. And that's basically what we do. We have a systematic way of looking at emotional intelligence competencies. We ask people 133 questions to talk about themselves and tell us about themselves, and then we hold them accountable in a subsequent interview. So that's what I mean by maybe the prediction in terms of whether someone's going to be a great employee in a role is not the best, because the conditions under which they take the EQI, there's pressure to answer in a way that may not be completely honest, but may just make them look a little bit better. So rather than using it for prediction, my preference is to use it for exploration. So we bring them back for a subsequent interview using either the actual EQI 2.0 leadership report, if you're certified to do so, or use the EITC recruiting report, in which we highlight those areas of strength as revealed by the EQI. And then we ask people, we suggest probes, we suggest questions which are designed to provide further evidence for what people say are their strengths. Then, in lower scoring areas, we suggest questions designed to explore those further and determine whether these lower scoring areas are going to be problematic for the role, or whether in fact they will not be problematic for the role. In any case, what we're doing is we're getting additional information that is worth exploring further. So this is really all about exploration. All we can really do with respect to selection and screening is explore, collect as much information as possible from a variety of sources. We're still gonna call references. We're still gonna maybe do our assessment center or our social functions. We're still going to do all those things, but this way is a systematic way of looking at what we now know from empirical evidence to be some of the best predictors of success that we have available to us with the EQI model. Okay, so we've looked at the recruiting report. So a quick summary, and then we'll get into our Q&A session. As what we're really talking about is as an add-on to other screening and selection processes, other sources of information. Add information about an applicant's emotional intelligence. It is going to tell you whether people are going to be able to have effective working relationships with others, whether they're going to be able to be flexible and adapt to your new processes and procedures, whether they're going to resist change or be on board with change. It's going to tell you a whole lot about someone's ability to fit into your organization and be effective in any role. So how are you going to do that? Well, you can use an interview like the one that I mentioned that you can read about in our blog post. Use interview questions based on the MHS model of EQ. Make up your own or use ours. And then secondarily, your choice is to use the EQI and then bring people back in. So generally what happens with the organizations that we work with is they have a short list of candidates, they give them all the EQI, we prepare our EITC recruiting reports for each person, they bring them back in for subsequent interviews in order to further explore those areas that people have already talked about for themselves. So, and you can either do it yourself by getting certified with us. We have our regular certification courses in major cities across the country, or if that's not something that you want to do, we can do the recruiting report for you at any time. So that's the content that I wanted to share with you today. And of course, there's Lucy. I've always wondered why you decided to be a dog. And Snoopy says, I was fooled by the job description. A little humor to end on. So let's go to questions and answers. I will open up the chat box and I will take a look at that. Also, I see that we have someone who has a lot of knowledge about using the EQI and emotional intelligence in recruiting and screening. And I may, in fact, ask Caroline Stokes from Forward to jump in and answer a couple questions. So let's begin the Q&A process. So what questions do you have for us this morning? I've got the chat box open and I've got the Q&A feature open here. And the next thing that I want to do is just make Carolyn a presenter. Where is that option here? I'm pretty sure that I have that ability. And I'm going to find Carolyn here momentarily. Okay, so here's a question. How much does it cost to get a recruiting report? Well, good question. Those generally depend on a couple of variables, but you can anticipate around that you can get that for just less than $1,000. Let's say that, and then depending on the numbers, we might be able to give you a volume discount. I try to take each case as it comes and find out what people are really interested in and what they want to do, and so we do that. Other questions? What questions do you have about this process or using the emotional intelligence? If people can fake the EQI, why use it in the interview process? Well, it's a good question, and the answer is that people can fake anything. People can fake it in the interview, so how do you know that someone's answering in an interview process? Honestly, you don't necessarily. So I guess you just try to go with it and do your best. Let's see. So question, I'd love to add some info on the cost compared with Korn Ferry. That's Carolyn. And Carolyn, I'm just trying to figure out how I can make you a presenter so that I can hear your lovely voice. And let's just click the video on for a second. So hi, everybody. Now, how can you help organizations? I'll just answer this question first while I'm looking for that button, Carolyn, to make you a presenter with me. How can you help organizations creating a competency map using the EQI? And that's a great question, and it's something that we have done in the past. And really, what we do is we take a look at the kinds of competencies that people have already determined for their various positions, and in some cases, the Korn Ferry Hay group has done their competencies, and interestingly, we can understand a whole lot about Hay competencies by using the EQI. The EQI building blocks are more discrete than the Hay competencies, and so we can, through looking at a combination of EQI competencies, understand. And we've actually created that kind of a map where we've had a list of Hay competencies, and then we've mapped them onto EQI competencies in order to understand how, if someone does well in certain areas on the EQI, that they would do well in those competencies, determined by the Hay group. Okay. What other... can the EQI be used to refuse candidates? And it's not a good idea. And of course, what we would never do is to never screen anyone out based on an EQI score or set of scores, just because there are so many variables involved. Rather, the best practices there are to bring someone back in for a subsequent interview and probe areas that you have any concerns about. So the EQI can never be used to refuse candidates, which brings up an interesting question that we used to get a lot when I started my career years ago, and I haven't heard it much in recent years, but the question of whether the EQI would stand up in court. Of course, you can see where that question is coming from. People who don't want to defend something in the case of perhaps a challenge or an appeal to a hiring decision, and the answer to that question is nothing will stand up on its own in court, and so you should never use one source of information. So as long as you have multiple sources of information, then of course then anything can be defended as a valid source of information. Nothing will stand on its own. All right, Carolyn, can you type in your response to the question about the cost of the EQI compared with the Korn Ferry assessment? One thing I know about the Korn Ferry Hay In any case, for those of you who don't know, the Corn Ferry merged or acquired Hay, or the other way around, so the Corn Ferry Hay Emotional Intelligence Assessment is only available as a 360. So there's not even a self-assessment tool that you can use. Carolyn says that Corn Ferry costs tens of thousands of dollars to evaluate. So versus the EQI, which I just told you, for around $1,000, you can get a recruiting report on someone based on their EQI results, with lots of additional information to further probe and explore, as I mentioned. Absolutely, Carolyn, the EQ is extremely cost effective to use. Carolyn has a really great process that she uses in terms of, Carolyn operates a recruitment agency. It's called Forward. You could visit her at forward.ca and learn more about her processes for using EQ and the EQI in recruiting and screening. And it is a method. Thank you, Carolyn. It's called theforward.co. Or the eirecruiter.com. That's another way to go. So awesome, Carolyn. Thank you for that. And Carolyn does some wonderful things in terms of working with candidates and coaching them based on their EQI scores, and then helping them to acclimatize and become more comfortable in the position, and supports them in their position for a period of time, which of course employers love, and really is a way to much better ensure success. So thank you, Carolyn, for that. Any other questions or comments that you have about using either the EQI or the concept of emotional intelligence in recruiting and screening? We will try to take those questions and answer those questions for you. This is an interesting one. How to help my boss to see the value of using an amazing tool like the EQI for hiring the perfect candidate, and I guess the answer is, of course, to demonstrate, maybe show a sample of the EQI, and we've got samples that we're certainly happy to share, samples of the EQI, samples of the recruiting report. By the way, all of you will get a sample EITC recruiting report so that you can take a look at it and see what's possible if you hire us to administer the EQI and interpret the EQI for your candidates. And the other is just showing an EQI leadership report, a sample, to the boss, and talk about, what are the kinds of things that are important for this candidate in terms of this candidate being successful and effective on our team, in our organization. There's also another document that might be helpful that we refer to as the ROI document, but it's an example of 9 case studies of major organizations where they use the EQI and emotional intelligence programming to one with the American military, that demonstrates using the EQI in the recruiting process, and how much money, millions of dollars saved by basing hiring decisions on and by incorporating the information that you get from an EQI report. But really, and I don't know if there's such a thing as a perfect candidate as is in the question, but of course you can better match a candidate to a role and have much more understanding of how of whether a candidate is going to be successful and effective in the role, based on information that you get from specifically focusing on, in a systematic way, understanding more about their emotional intelligence competencies. So looks like that's all the questions. Carolyn said that the American military saved $3 million using the EQI, and specifically what they were hiring, quite interestingly, was recruiters. So they were hiring recruiters who were going to then, of course, go out and talk to young people about the American military, and I think it was specifically the Air Force, and get people to sign up for the Air Force. And when they used the EQI, they found that those people, they had far less turnover. Turnover, as you all know, costs organizations a whole lot of money. How can we reduce turnover? Well, do a better job of hiring and onboarding, and you will save money in turnover. And so they used the EQI and the information that came from the EQI in their recruiting and in their screening and selection process, and saved $3 million. All right, so thanks everybody for joining us today on our webinar. Do come join us for future topics. We'll be sharing those topics with you, and hoping that you will come back and see us again at the Emotional Intelligence Training Company. Consider certification if you haven't already. Consider coming and taking the certification course, and then being able to bring this expertise in-house. And you can do your own EQI administration, do your own interpretation and understanding of candidates by looking at their actual EQI reports, like Carolyn does, and some others of you as well. And again, if there's ever anything that we can do for you related to emotional intelligence, to talk about leadership development, coaching, training, keynotes, etc., very happy to do that. Check out Carolyn's site, theeirecruiter.com, and Carolyn's either finished her book or working on her book, which is going to be, a great resource for recruiters in terms of understanding more about how to use emotional intelligence in the recruitment process. And then she's got her program and training as well. So thanks, Carolyn,